I stand for. Okay, so you can all hear me, we are not in the vast space. So welcome, good afternoon, thanks for coming. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ben-Ghiat, and I'm the director of the Institute for Public Humanities and the Arts, which is known as Hofstra. All this year, we've been focusing on events to advance faculty careers, support faculty in their scholarship, and in work that they're doing to move outward from just inside university walls to the general public. We've done this in a number of ways. Today, we have a really wonderful event with two exemplars of public humanities, two of the best. We have Ruth Ben-Ghiat of New York University and Jim Downs. These are two high-profile public intellectuals and highly accomplished academic historians. Both have found success in the world of university scholarship and have turned that scholarship outward to contribute to and serve their communities regionally, nationally, internationally. Both have over time connected their history to contemporary urgent political issues, and both have succeeded in explaining to the general public through media appearances, publishing in global publications, writing and speaking to a in a widely accessible style, the relevance of having a highly trained scholarly vision in the understanding of politics. I've known both Ruth and Jim for many years, and I have watched their careers develop over time as they expanded their work, and this is how I know what great models they are for an Institute for Public Humanities. Ruth Ben-Ghiat is someone you may know from her frequent appearances on television. She is a regular commentator on air for MS Now. Ruth is professor of history at New York University, where she specializes in authoritarianism, propaganda, and resistance to tyranny. She's also a senior fellow at the Charles F. Kettering Foundation. Ruth is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Strong Men, Mussolini to the Present, and several books on Italian fascism. She is the publisher of the Substack newsletter, Lucid, which is about threats to democracy. She has recently just signed a contract for her new book, which is called Resisting Autocracy, and she will tell us more about that too. Ruth is a consultant on television and film production, including Guillermo del Toro's Academy Award-winning 2022 movie Pinocchio, and the 2024 Netflix docuseries Hitler and the Nazis: Evil on Trial. Jim Downs is the Gilder Lehrman NEH Professor of History at Gettysburg College. He is the author of Maladies of Empire, How Colonialism, Slavery, and War Transformed Medicine, which has been translated into Chinese, French, Japanese, Korean, and Russian. His other books include Sick from Freedom, African American Sickness and Suffering During the Civil War and Reconstruction, and Stand By Me, The Forgotten History of Gay Liberation. Jim has edited 7 anthologies and published in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, The Lancet, LA Times. He is the editor of Civil War History, a partner in History Studio, and I want to talk to you about that as well. Co-editor of History in the Headlines, and director of the program in African American History at the Library Company of Philadelphia. Jim was elected to the Society for American Historians, also the Royal Historical Society in the UK, and is on the executive board of the Southern Historical Association. In 2015 to 16, he was a Mellon New Directions Fellow, and I find this fascinating too, which allowed him to return to graduate school after he had earned tenure to gain training in medical anthropology and epidemiology at Harvard. Jim holds his PhD from Columbia, and just this past year, 2025, he became a Guggenheim Fellow. Ruth and Jim will each talk about their own work and trajectory relatively briefly, and then we're going to open it up for a communal conversation and discussion, questions, all of it. So please join me in welcoming Ruth Ben-Ghiat and Jim Downs to Hofstra. So, are you okay with starting? Oh, sure. Okay.
Probably a mic.
Do you want to take, so I'll just sit here. It's fine. Because I don't have slides, so. Yeah, just on.
Is it on?
Yep, it's on.
Okay. All right, thanks. So I work on fascism, and I think that I became interested in California as a teenager in fascism because a lot of my town, Pacific Palisades, had a lot of exiles from Nazism who had lived there. And I was, thinking about what does it mean to have a regime come in and you have to flee and start all over again, like halfway around the world. So I ended up studying Italian fascism in grad school, and early on, and I wrote a book about intellectual collaboration with the fascist regime, writers, filmmakers, humanities people. And I discovered early on that only some people in Italy were allowed to comment on these subjects, and an American woman from California was not one of them. So there were attacks in newspapers and threats of lawsuits, and because I was doing something, talking about things that you weren't supposed to talk about. At the same time, I lived off and on in Italy during Berlusconi's time. And Berlusconi was the first person to bring the far right back into government since 1945. And so I witnessed what it meant in daily life to normalize extremism, where Berlusconi would say, oh, Mussolini, he never killed anyone. He just sent people to islands that are like holiday resorts. And so I've been going to Rome a long time, and so, for example, my dry cleaner, when we used to say, oh, you're still studying fascism, and then there was an awkward silence. Now, she said, oh, Mussolini was great. The only people he made problems for were subversives and Jews. So not a big deal, right? So I saw this, I lived through this normalization of extremism, the rewriting of history. So I was prepared to see what was happening here very early on. And my entry, Rhonda wanted us to talk about how we, were able to start doing this public work. So I had started writing for CNN in 2014. And the reason was there was the centenary of World War I. And in England, where my mom lives, it was a huge deal. In France, it was a huge deal. And so I thought it would be, and I teach classes on war. And I thought it would be interesting to do like an opinion series. What are the legacies of 100 years? Is there any, remaining legacy of World War I? But I didn't know anyone. So I didn't know anybody in journalism. So I went to the deputy director of media relations at NYU. And I said, I have this really good idea, but do you know anyone? And he's like, yeah, I know somebody at CNN. And so we pitched it, we had a pitch meeting, we went there, and then they ended up doing it. And that was how this whole thing started. So I wrote for them on historical things, and then in 2015, when Trump was doing his campaign, I started seeing things that I thought were really dangerous. So I already had a foothold there to write. So I wrote in the fall of 2015 pieces on, one was called Beware of Bannon's White Nationalism. Another was, I read things about people getting beaten up because they were speaking Spanish. So I had a piece, and I had just finished chairing the Italian department, so this was in defense of learning languages. And I think they titled it, Why It's Good to Speak Spanish in America. So against xenophobia. So all of this, so I had this foothold, and then when things started happening and Trump said I could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone, and I wouldn't lose any followers, and that was January 2016, I was ready, and I had very good editors who, to their huge credit, published everything. They never censored me. So so I covered the whole campaign and on from there. And the thing is, many times in the U.S., being a public intellectual is something that can be a bit elitist. You publish in the New York Times or the New York Review of Books. Maybe you went to the same schools as the New York Times people. I didn't do any of that. I started with, you could say, a mass market place. And CNN, you reached so many people. You heard from soldiers who were stationed on bases, around the world. You heard from all kinds of people. And that was very important for me, to reach a wide variety of people and reach people all over the world. So I started on a different path than many other people. And that's important. So I think that being a historian has been important because I've been able to see patterns throughout history. And my book Strongmen, which came out in 2020 and then a new edition in 2021, it goes over 100 years. And so I've been able to often predict what autocrats will do. From I got a bad feeling about Putin a few months before he invaded Ukraine. I was able to say that there was no way that Trump was going to leave office quietly. A long record of forecasts and stuff. And that's because history allows you to, I know how these guys think, but also there are certain situations that autocrats behave in a certain way where other people don't behave that way. So that's also given me a kind of following, and so that's felt very useful, because people, when you have a time where it's very scary for people, people want to be able to understand. And so I have tried to kind of ground things historically and comparatively and allow people in the US to feel like this is what's unfolding here, this is how it's different, these are the roots of it. So that's been helpful for people. So when you do public work, you come to the attention of people who don't like what you're saying. So there have been a few unpleasant episodes along with a lot of fantastic things. And you can take these moments to realize that you're probably doing something good if you're angering them. And a case in point was in 2022, Trump sued CNN for supposedly comparing him to Hitler, and he sued them for $475 million. And this, I believe, is why they shut down CNN Opinion, which is where I was writing. And so there was one freelancer and one op-ed that was mentioned in the complaint, and it was me, along with Jake Tapper and people who were full-time employees. And I never compared him to Hitler, but what they took issue with was a 2021 op-ed where I basically deconstructed his propaganda machine about the big lie. And I teach propaganda classes. And so that was interesting to me. It was unpleasant. I wasn't personally sued, and then a Trump-appointed judge threw it out. And he keeps trying to revive it, but they keep throwing it out, so it's been fine. But that signaled to me what I was doing that was right, because it was touching a nerve, and it was something that that the public really needed to hear about. Another more successful was I was invited, and it was a huge honor, to do the Bancroft Lecture at the U.S. Naval Academy. And that was 2024. It was going to be right before the election. And they approved the topic, which was on coups, and I was going to talk about Pinochet primarily, about what happens when an armed forces are used against domestic population. And I was also going to teach a class and talk about images in war, and I was all excited to do that. And so I got a call from the head of the Naval Academy that they were disinviting me. And it turned out that there had been a huge coordinated campaign by the Heritage Foundation, by the Federalist Society, and 18 members of Congress wrote a letter against me. And it was very interesting because I study things like this. I study authoritarian silencing operations. And the way it was all coordinated, it had a lot of resonance with things I'd written about in Strongmen also. So these are things that can happen if you are out there, so to speak. But there's a whole other side that has been really rewarding. So I have this mission of civic education, which is helping people to understand how authoritarianism functions, how resistance can be used, what can work, and all of it grounded in history. So I have done thousands of interviews over the years, not just American, but all over. I just did like Bulgarian national radio, all over the world. And as you get foreign editions of your books, then you'll get a Japanese edition just came out, so I'm doing Japanese media. I also have advised civil society organizations. I worked with the United Methodist Church, labor unions, activist groups, like the big grassroots activist organizations. And then like things that are off the record, like with members of Congress, there's a huge desire to understand right now how these processes work, how this authoritarian logic works, and what people can do about it. So that I'd also testified to the January 6th committee and did 2 interviews and wrote a report. So there's a whole activity of explaining and advising and consulting. And then Rhonda mentioned I do film consulting and documentaries and kind of fact-checking, stuff like that, helping to shape characters that are true to the history. So that's also what you can get involved in if you are doing public humanities. And so the other thing I'll just mention is I started a Substack. There are like apparently millions of Substacks now. But, and they came to me in 2018, and I was so busy that I said, no, go away. And then in 2021, I was ready. After January 6th, I thought, I need to do something. So I gave it the title Lucid, as in, having a clear mind, not escaping the fog of disinformation and hatred. And so I write essays, but as an act of civic education, I wanted to have an interactive component. So I have Zooms once a week with paying subscribers. First it wasn't paywalled, but then we got hacked by trolls, like by homophobic far-right trolls. So I had to institute a paywall. And there are people who have been coming every week for 5 years. It's an incredible community, and it's grown to over 200,000 subscribers, and about 500-600 people show up to the Zooms. When I started, it was like 23, 24 people. But yeah, we just had the 5th anniversary, and there are people who've come every week, and so it's a community. And and we talk a lot about language. About what should we, as things are happening so fast here, and it's so upsetting and you can lose your bearings, what do we call things? How should we talk about things? What are the stakes of language? What are the stakes of the often kind of cautious headlines in the newspapers? What's not being said, right? So we really talk a lot about language, and that relates directly to my training. I wrote about language policy, and also being a teacher, you need to speak clearly, and writing for CNN, you've got to write clearly. So that's been very helpful to people, that whole part of it. And I've tried really hard to keep a balance in my coverage and what I write about between the US and global, which I do in my scholarship too. And so Lucid is read in 195 countries, including all of the autocracies. I guess they use a VPN. Not Eritrea because they don't have internet, but the ones that have internet, it's read there. Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, China, Russia, all those places got subscribers. So that feels like I've built something, not really knowing how or what I was doing, but just organically from the desire to help people understand. I'll also just say that it's been a bestseller in the world politics category, and it's the only one that is done by a woman. So that I'm really proud of, and I have a very tiny team, and it's an all-woman. I do all the writing and fact-checking and editing, but I have people help me with Zoom, so it's an all-woman operation, and it's the only one that's in the bestseller, then the top 10 that is a woman published. So that's about it. And so I did one book for a trade book on strongmen, on autocrats, and I wanted to do now another one on resistance. And so I'm much better known now, and so there was a lot of interest in it, and that was a whole learning process. And we just announced it last week, and so it's going to be, the full title is, Resisting Autocracy, What History Teaches Us About Fighting Back. So it's lessons from, there's a lot of present content there will be, but lessons from around the world of, how do you construct, how do you channel how do you take your courage in your hand and channel and revive your conscience when authoritarian regimes want you to forget your conscience? And then how do you construct coalitions that are going to work, and on from there. So that's an overview. Thank you so much.
So first of all, I just want to thank Rhonda for inviting me here. I first met her when I was an assistant professor at Connecticut College, and the day that I interviewed, I saw an article about her on the dean's desk, and I was immediately struck by her because she won this big NEH grant, etc. And she has often been a lodestar in the field, both for her capacious imagination and also for prodigious contributions to the humanities. So I'm deeply honored to be here. At the risk of sounding like a used car salesman and or a motivational speaker, I set up today's talk with 3 Ps that I came up with at the gym this morning, because I was thinking about how could I make this into a workshop that would be most helpful to people who are interested in doing the public humanities, and more importantly, what would be the mantra that would have helped me throughout this process of doing it? Because unlike Ruth,
yeah. I think it's because all of the microphones are on. Hold on.
Okay, it's better, yes, better, okay. So unlike Ruth, I've had a very uneven path in terms of how I've done public humanities. And so it's really important to think about how could you do this work at the same time of doing your other intellectual work. And so I want to begin by really thinking about how I started in this and why I decided to get involved. And part of it was when I was an undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania. It was at a time when literary critics were on the front lines of the culture wars. And I, at the time, wanted to be an actor. I was thinking about going to law school, but for some reason, my English professors made the world of ideas the most exciting thing. And I often remember professors talking about the idea of appearing on radio or writing letters to the editor to inform public debates. And I never thought of that as an appendium to scholarly work. I thought that all that they did was really just produce monographs that were sitting on a shelf in a library. And so I was trained in many ways by scholars in Black studies and in feminist studies who always were very persistent about trying to bridge the divide between the public and the academy. And so that's been a running sort of motivation for me throughout my career. So when Rhonda said, let's talk about this, let's do this, I thought, okay, my first start was in writing for the Huffington Post. And then, as a good historian, I did research on myself and realized I had an archive that I forgot about, which was, and these are kind of embarrassing, but I was a huge fan of Katie Brophy. Despite some of her arguments, she can write a sentence. And she wrote this piece on feminism, and so a young Jim Downs in 1997 decided to write a letter to the editor to congratulate Katie Brophy on having an argument about feminism. So I'm just going to read it because I think it's important for two reasons. One, in terms of method, how do we take these sophisticated ideas about feminism that were percolating both in the culture wars on campus and in like highly arcane, sophisticated theories in classrooms, and then make it legible to the public? And then how do we get our training wheels as public intellectuals? And one of the easy ways of doing it is letters to the editor. They're concise, they're easy to write, you're not having to pitch lots of editors, and I had my best luck. So here's young Jim Downs in the 90s commenting on this, and Ruth, I hope you didn't read it because I don't even know what I said. In her insightful article, Brophy challenges mainstream feminism with her brilliant analysis of the predicament of the 90s woman, and with her honest articulation of the desires women have in a post-feminist world. Her writing clearly represents the complexities of feminism and the need to reinvent the notion of feminist. It's kind of vague, I don't even like it, but this is the point. And again, I don't know why I felt the need to actually say this, but again, there's something that I remember at a very young age, one of my Hebrew teachers teaching me, which was the idea of having desire. Like, you need to have the desire to want to do this work. You need to have the desire to want to learn. And so at this point in my life, I had this deep desire to learn and to develop. This article was a story in Philadelphia about these two white students who were at the University of Delaware, and they were upset that she was pregnant, so they committed an infanticide. They killed the baby, and it was this huge debate. And so I wrote this article about violence and about the ways in which sort of whiteness works. And I think I ended it by saying what concerns people is not what they did. What concerns people was the proximity. They look like you. And so it was really like tapping into some of the whiteness studies, tapping into some of the race stuff, and trying to get involved in a public debate. And then coming here, I didn't even realize this, but I had written something about Monica Lewinsky, and I brought in Cagney and Lacey, Leave It to Beaver, Jane Austen, Generation X. And the point here was that as a young literary critic, as someone in college, I was interested in thinking about how can we talk about all of these different texts and how could they be useful in helping to inform a public debate. And so my professors would have these sort of comments, alt-ant comments that would connect pop culture to what we had in class and to the news. And so I was really sort of grasping for some opportunity to do this. This is the kind of stuff that I'm happy that it's really hard to find. I had to spend like $7.95 for newspaper, some archive to get it, and I hope it disappears, but I want to use it as an example to say that it was a really important and easy entry point to kind of figure out what is it that you wanted to do. And at that point in my career, I wanted to talk about culture, and I wanted to create that bridge. I then start writing for the Huffington Post, and I got really lucky. There was an earthquake in Haiti, and I had this piece that I wanted to do as a historian of medicine to think about outbreaks of cholera. So the publicist at Connecticut College pitched me to Huffington Post. They liked the article, and similar to Ruth, they then gave me access to begin publishing all of these different pieces. And at that point, I would not, this is not on my website, I don't share this with people, but I put it up because I want to say that I really cut my teeth on this. I had very few editors. I had very little guidance in what I was writing, but what it taught me to do was to write in short form, and it taught me how to really think about developing a headline that could capture an audience, and it was at the same time when social media was starting to develop. So this sort of demise of print journalism and the rise of social media created this forum like the Huffington Post that allowed me to cover a range of topics, from stuff about Rachel Dolezal to Charlie Sheen and HIV. Beyonce had a video, Formation, which I love, and I decided to write on that. So it was really just, how could we take the ideas in the academy, apply them to pop culture, and then sort of move forward. And it was more of a training ground. When my book came out, Sick from Freedom, the history of it is that we know that the Civil War, more soldiers died from disease than from battle. And those are battles unrelated to gunshot wounds or injuries. What we never think about, what we don't know, is that the emancipation of over 4 million people created a huge refugee crisis. And that refugee crisis led to high rates of morbidity and mortality. Many formerly enslaved people were freed, but they had nowhere to go. I mean, this is sort of what Ruth is saying about what happens when a fascist regime takes over. This was a different kind of transition. This was the collapse of slavery and the rise of a free labor economy. But Lincoln, the White House, the radical members of Congress did not think about the humanitarian needs of formerly enslaved people. And so I reconstructed a smallpox epidemic that showed 60,000 freed people died. And then on top of that, there was a cholera pandemic. And so I wrote the book for many reasons. I mean, personal reasons, historiographical reasons, scholarly reasons, etc. And I never really thought that the book would cross over. But I wanted to do a book party, and somehow I got contact with the Barnes & Noble, and on 82nd Street in New York City, and they felt bad that I was publishing with Oxford University Press, so they were willing to fund the advertisement. I know they were able to fund the advertisement for my event in the New York Times. And I got Annette Gordon-Reed, who is a leading historian, to be in conversation with me. And then that led to Jenny Schuessler of the New York Times covering the event and showing up in the audience. And then the next day, when I was supposed to fly to my friend's wedding, I had to interview her. She had to interview me in a coffee shop in Chelsea where I lived. And it was really baptism by fire, because I had always thought of myself as the person who would author a piece and be in control of the headline. And here, she was asking me questions about the book, about the field, about why it mattered. And it was part of a larger sort of event that was happening in the Times and in scientific journals, which was, we knew that 650,000 soldiers died during the Civil War. This was the number of people had said from the 1860s down to the present. New census data suggested that the mortality rate was over 700,000. My book said, that's fine, but you never take into consideration Black people. So the number is actually much higher. They were dying in the same camps. So why I put this up is not just to show what I look like at 39, was to say I also hope that we could use this workshop to talk about how do you talk to a journalist? How do you take very complex ideas and present them? And I was, at that moment, sort of forced into explaining the argument of the book to a journalist and not knowing, and this was also very important, but because this is a workshop, not knowing if the story would ever make it. My editors at Oxford University Press were really reluctant that anything was going to happen. It no sooner came out, and then it got picked up in The Guardian, it got picked up in BBC, it got picked up in New Zealand, it got picked up in all over the world. And then I was interviewing all over the world. And so
one of the things I've learned was to try my best to explain the argument in 3 to 5 sentences without mentioning the other scholars. So you could say, like, other scholars have focused on politics during Reconstruction and the creation of the amendments. No one has talked about the mortality rates. It's a very simple, concise, lucid sentence, but at the time, as an assistant professor, I was mired into historiographic debates. I wasn't thinking like that. So I've done all of these different shows, and when this happened too, I was getting calls for conservative radio and TV, and initially I was reluctant, but then at the same time I felt compelled, based on my undergraduate training, that I wanted to reach out to people and I wanted to talk to them about it. When I was doing this book, I'll just give you this trajectory just because it's interesting. I went to the Tribeca Film Festival, and I saw this documentary called Gay Sex in the 70s. And essentially what it did was it said the 1970s was this huge major moment of liberation, and then all of a sudden the music stops, something happens, HIV develops. And afterwards, the director talked, men who were part of the movement were in the audience, testified. Everyone sort of believed in this narrative about the 70s, that the 70s could be reduced to, one night at a sex party. And I walked out of the theater and I said the narrative arc is wrong. Just in the way that during the 1860s, the discourse of freedom obscured a health crisis. The opposite was true for the 70s. A health crisis obscured the discourse of freedom. So what was happening in the world in the 1970s? And I volunteered when I was an undergraduate at the William Way Community Center, which was a gay and lesbian center in Philadelphia. And what I was doing was I was taking literally trash bags full of people's personal items, their papers, their letters, their diaries, their playbills, whatever they left before they passed away from HIV, whether they moved, and they were given to gay community centers, which were the shelters for trans youth, drag queen bingo, HIV testing, and they became makeshift libraries, and I knew that. And so if I wanted to say, well, what happened during the 1970s, in addition to sex, I couldn't go to the Library of Company in Philadelphia, where I'm now in charge of the African American Research Unit, because there was no catalog for gay stuff. I couldn't go next door to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. I couldn't go to the National Archives. Some of this has to do with the long-standing problem of an identity versus an act, and how do we talk about that? So this is all going to connect. So I came up with a book idea that I actually sold before this came out, which is not a good idea. And it was called Stand By Me, The Forgotten History of Gay Liberation. And here I am again looking like an itinerant minister with a microphone. I had such a huge, big blow up with Sick from Freedom that, to be completely frank with you, I was kind of devastated that the book didn't blow up immediately in the same way. So I had to sort of do whatever I could to promote the book. So a friend of mine owned a gay bar in DC, and I did the book talk there. This is a gay bar, and then I got on C-SPAN, and then eventually I started getting called to be an expert. At the time, I worked with Basic Books, and they had a publicist who pitched me to the New York Times, who I had written for already, and they all knew me there. And I gave them so many different ideas about the book, and they said, no, no, no. And finally, the one editor was like, yes, we have this idea, and I won't get into it. And this is the part about perseverance and persistence. And I had gone through so many drafts of the article. And then finally, at Sunday night at 10:55, during the Oscars, he sends me an email saying, we're not going to roll with it. We're not doing it. And it felt like such a gut punch, because it felt like the book didn't have a life, and it felt like I couldn't get it out there. That was March, April of 2016. I then did a book talk that I organized myself again at the Barnes & Noble in Philadelphia, Rittenhouse Square. I went out with my friends afterward, might have had too much to drink. I woke up the next morning to news of the Pulse Massacre, which was the largest massacre of gay people at a nightclub in Florida. At that point, I was at my parents' house. I went up into the loft and I wrote to the editor of the Times and I said, I will have something to you by 4 o'clock. And he said, okay. And so I sat down and I wrote a piece, which was then before Orlando, there was New Orleans, because what I discovered in my book was that in 1973 in New Orleans, in the French Quarter, on the second floor of a bar called the Upstairs Lounge, LGBT people gathered to celebrate the 4th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising. When that was over, and many of them, close to 40 of them, stayed in that second floor room in order to have a congregation called the Metropolitan Community Church. So much of the history of gay liberation has not told us about the fact that in the 1970s, gay people created their own churches, their own synagogues. We have often inherited this idea that part of coming out was rebelling against religious authorities, but what we haven't seen, because we've been sort of induced into trying to understand how HIV spread, that many LGBT people created a huge religious movement. And so they were in New Orleans on the second floor. Someone knocked on the door. They said, "Who are you?" They wouldn't let them in because it was like nighttime in New Orleans and it was in a sort of seedy part of the city. And then later on, someone came and detonated a Molotov cocktail and it killed 32 people. That story, which I uncovered for the book, has been obscured instead of telling a story of sex to explain HIV. And so what I was trying to do in the op-ed was say there's a long pattern of violence against gay people, that what we're seeing in New Orleans, in Florida, is not that different from what we're seeing in New Orleans. Then I, like Ruth, knowing how people think and predict what's going to happen next, I said, I bet the person they claim who did this at Pulse in Florida, they're going to say he's gay. Because ultimately they've never found out who detonated the Molotov cocktail in New Orleans, but there was always arguments that this person was gay. So then I needed to write an op-ed and I got it out in the New York Daily News of all places, and to try to explain the history of sexuality in a couple of sentences, to say the person that may have been accused of this crime may have had sex with men, but he might not have been, quote, gay. Those are two different things. That eventually led me to writing another piece on Peter Thiel when he went to the Republican National Convention and announced that he was gay and that he was supporting Trump in 2016. At that point, the right attacked me. The comms person at the time, Connecticut College, asked me if I wanted a security escort to my classes because I was getting death threats that were going to the president, that were going all over, because of a simple, basic idea that we have learned from Foucault, from the history of sexuality, could not get translated into the public in a deep way. And Peter Thiel then went after me many times. Maureen Dowd jumped in and said I was nasty because I was trying to offer a historical context. I was like, yes, he's a man who has sex with men, but being gay means embracing a certain culture. Gay comes out of a certain moment of time. It's not just about an act, it's about recognition of a cultural identity. We can debate that, but my point was trying to take an idea which was part of any history of sexuality 101 and make that part of the political discourse was sort of impossible. Do I have 2 minutes? Okay. So I've then done a bunch of other stuff for the New Yorker and other places where I try to, and this is the hook, I always try to hook to an anniversary. So when it's Queer Gay Pride Month, this is a really important way for academics to get into the public conversation. This is a fascinating story about Eve Adams, who is a Jewish woman who comes to the U.S. as a labor activist and is eventually sent to Auschwitz. It's a fascinating story that we don't know. This is about research I found when I was doing work on my third book on the origins of epidemiology. I found in the British archives, in the records of a ship captain, them saying that prisoners call themselves married, and they actually use the term marriage. And so the only way that these pieces came out was because of the anniversary to LGBT Pride and providing a bit of a context. I've done a bunch of stuff for The Atlantic on the pandemic. I'm happy to talk about it. What was really interesting was that people wanted me to just eviscerate Trump, and my argument was anyone can eviscerate Trump. I can give you the history of epidemiology, which was then part of my third book, and they weren't really that interested, so we can get to that in a second. And then I found this editor at the LA Times that was willing to talk to me and listen to what I had to say about the problems of the reporting and the numbers and how all of this was problematic from an epidemiological perspective. These are just other pieces that I've done. Queer Like Pete was a piece that went viral because so many people on social media were calling him, the little Boy Scout, and I had to explain that was part of a gay persona that he was using to protect himself. And then these other pieces, and then this piece, I'll just end on this really quickly. Heated rivalry is all the rage. So I started with culture and I'm going to end with culture. It's a television show that came out with HBO. I had a lot to say about it. I pitched it to the Times, no response. And then I pitched it to Slate. They said yes. So this is about the mechanics of how the process works in this way. 2 days later, I'm at brunch in New York, and the Times writes back and says, we're interested. And then I think, oh no, I really want to go with the Times because it's a bigger audience, blah, blah, blah. But Slate has already said yes. And so then I contact the Times the next day, and I'm like, do you have edits? And the guy says to me, oh, I have edits, but this piece really needs a lot of thinking. And I'm like, I have a PhD in thinking. Like, I'm fine. Like, can you give me the edits? And then this is part of the persistence, and this is part of what happens in the writing, which is that you have to be resilient in this process, because a lot of times they're interested in you really quickly, and then they're not interested in you. And so I said, you know what, I'm getting a sense, it's kind of like dating, like you're not that into me. So I just pulled it, and I published it with Slate, December 29, 2025. I watched the season finale. I fell in love with it. It was amazing. I wrote the piece overnight. I sent it to them, and 2 days later, they were not upset that I had gone. And I got this piece out, which went viral and has been talked about all over. So thank you. I'm sorry if I went too long.
Thank you. I don't know if mine's on. Probably not. Thanks to both of you. I loved hearing both of your stories. And I'd like to open it up. I myself have many questions, but I'm going to. Oh, the camera needs to go. Is that on now? Is that on?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's open it up for audience questions. I see Leslie's.
It's not really a question, I just have a comment. Thank you both for coming, it's very interesting. I always tell my students, de Tocqueville has never been proven wrong. Also, I like the fact that you mentioned Leave It to Beaver. I wrote a book about the Beverly Hillbillies. So I always tell my students, de Tocqueville has never been proven wrong. And de Tocqueville talks about tyranny and also about letters to the editor.
So thank you so much for this. Thank you so much for this. It was extremely inspiring. So Jim, my question is for you. Like when you're trying to balance out, or are you trying to balance out the ways that you're thinking about kind of like culture or medicine or identity? Like, is this all connected for you? Do things kind of come up as they come up? Because it seems to be sort of a beautifully varied and resonant series of works.
So the one thing I didn't mention is there isn't a mindset. I don't have this sort of overarching organizing principle that's led to the publication of these various pieces. The one thing I wanted to mention, and I forgot to include it, was a slide that I want to call Boomerang, because part of going to the mainstream press is that I have had the door slammed in my face so many times. So for every piece that I've ever gotten out, I have 20 rejections. Not just for that piece, but sometimes for 10 other pieces. And so there was a time like in between my second and third book that I had such terrible experiences with the trade world and with ideas that it just boomeranged me back into thinking about how wonderful it is to publish with the university press and how wonderful it is to work with an academic journal because you don't have these issues. So the thing about the New York Times piece, I called it Before New Orleans, There Was Orlando. People pulled from that story. So many Times reporters, and they talked about New Orleans like it was like Watergate, like it was something that they knew. They never cited me. And so that was like deeply problematic. What also happened in terms of the book deal issue was Norton wanted to put in an offer for that book, but they just wanted me to write about the fire, and I decided not to. When I turned them down and I went to Basic, they then commissioned somebody else to write the story just about the fire, and then the guy opens the book after my piece came out saying, no one's ever talked about this. And the other thing I didn't put up was I got a piece out in time that I tried to sort of lay the ground. So I've had lots of frustrating moments that I've had to step away, and then I came back with the rivalry stuff. But I also say, allow yourself to do it when you have a topic that works, when it fits, but also allow yourself to step away, and it might give you a more renewed interest in academic publishing, and then go back to it if another topic opens.
So, I want, okay. One thing about is, yes, the resilience. I tried to publish in the New York Times for 10 years, and they never ever responded to me even once. And only in 2025 did I start publishing there. And then you can have a season where they publish you and then they don't want to publish you anymore. That's happened to me with The Atlantic. There's nothing I can do to get anything in there now. It's just how it is, and you can't personalize it. The other thing that happens and is that your concepts will be used if you're doing a lot of public work. And my aim is to get stuff into the mainstream about like helping people understand authoritarianism. When I first started, nobody could pronounce the word authoritarianism. They didn't know what a personality cult was. And so I helped along with others to popularize that. But the concepts will be used and there will be no attribution to you. So you have to be, and there's huge gender politics of this too. And women, it's much easier sometimes for the woman not to be recognized or to get. I had my strongman got totally bashed in the New York Times in a sexist review, and there were a bunch of sexist reviews. Like I should have stayed in my lane. I should have just written about Mussolini. Why was I going over my head to do these things? But so that's one issue. There are definitely gender politics, but if you want to be recognized for what you're doing, but you also, if you're doing it at scale, and you want to get these concepts into the mainstream, then they will be used, and you have to be okay with that, right? And then that's a good thing in some way. You don't want people stealing your stuff, but it's in there. So now, often, like I heard the co-founder of Indivisible, after No Kings, or before No Kings, and he was talking about the strongman, and it was really uncanny because what he was saying could have come directly out of my mouth. And I know he reads my things. So I could have gotten all like, well, wait a minute, like it's almost like a ventriloquism. But I was very pleased because it means that the ideas have circulated. And if civic education is the goal, right, that's a good thing. And the other thing, and Jim's presentation brought this up, once you start talking to journalists, there's a degree to which you lose control. For example, you also don't decide, unless you have it in a contract, and I never had a contract with the Times or anything, you don't have control of the headlines. So it happened to me with the New Yorker. I published a piece on how fascist monuments in Italy are still standing, and compared it to Germany after Nazism. And they gave it a title, "Why Are So Many Fascist Monuments Still Standing?" And this created a giant controversy in Italy. I mean, I got death threats because people thought that I was advocating, because of the title, for all of the fascist monuments to just be bulldozed. And that I was some Dumbo American who didn't know how to appreciate architecture. So that's an example, that's an extreme example. There have been conferences, there's even 2 master's theses about this controversy that happened because of this one article with a dicey title. So you know that going in, but that's part of the equation when you start doing a lot of public work.
Hi, I have a question. So you studied, I assume you know a lot about the Weimar Republic? Okay, so I just have a question that I'd like to ask about that. I think it's pretty tempting to teach about Weimar Germany thematically as opposed to like an in-depth discussion of the exact political events that led to the rise of the Nazis. But what would you say about the political legacy and legitimacy of that 15 years of democratic experiment buttressed between obviously Imperial Germany and Nazi Germany? Because I believe it was a worthwhile experiment. What do you think?
Sure. Well, of course it was a worthwhile experience, and it makes the tragedy that came after all the more terrible, because, and also shows that truly it can happen anywhere, because the Germans were, at the time Hitler came in, the Germans were one of the most advanced countries in the world. They had the highest literacy rate, one of the highest in all over the world. They had the most newspapers. They had way more newspapers than Great Britain and France. They, in technology, in medicine, in design, of course, in graphic design, and any kind of arts, they were the cutting edge. They also were the epicenter of gay life. Berlin had like dozens of gay bars. So it was a place of incredible ingenuity and innovation, and a social welfare system that was like imitated elsewhere, so getting away just from knowledge even, sure. And yet, and that made it all the more surprising for many people that this happened there. Because we always want to say, well, people didn't understand, they were ignorant, and so they elected, or Hitler was appointed. They backed this lunatic. But Germans were highly literate. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Daniel?
I have a question for both of you, but Ruth.
Speak up.
Oh, sorry, yes. I want to pose this as a question, because it's kind of a comment. One thing that you're greatly admirable for about strongman. I'm wondering if there's been a kind of backlash that the term strongman is actually appealing to someone like Trump and other authoritarians.
Sure.
That's always occurred to me, and I wondered what you've experienced about that.
Yeah, it's true, because it's a word that in fact isn't idealized. It's what they want to be is considered strong, when instead they're weak, they're insecure. That's why they do half of what they do. So it's not ideal, but I used it also because my book was the first to have, it's the first examination of the autocratic tools that has a whole chapter on masculinity. And I integrate gender. I say that, hypermasculinity is just as much used as a tool of domination as propaganda, corruption, violence, and they work together. And I have a whole argument about this. And so these guys who style themselves as strong men, that was part of the argument. So I don't regret using it, but yes, people write me every day saying, I'm very irritated that you use this term because it buys into what they want to be, and it's right, of course.
May I jump in there for a second? Side note, while Ruth was working on that book, I was trying to write a similar but different book which speaks to that question, but I completely failed. That is to say, this book, much of it already written, is still in my drawer. And this is because it was about the opposite. It was about the sort of undercurrent of femininity that was being employed by a certain strongman personality at the very same time, and including by President Trump, and who is, he's so sort of hyper-masculine that he comes up around the other side, where you have a fully made up, dyed, teased hair, very soft bodied persona. And I had a whole, and I went back in time and I did a whole sort of interpretation of women's sort of adornment culture and how it can be appropriated by a certain kind of fascistic male personality. So I shopped that around. A number of editors in New York said, this is nuts, this makes no sense. And not only that, but soon everyone will be tired of talking about fascism and strongman and Donald Trump. And so by the time you finish this book, no one will care and it will all be over. So, okay. The lesson here is, don't believe everything you hear, one, and this might have been an occasion to go to a university press. I did not do that. But it was also not a scholarly topic because it had to do with makeup and hair and so things that seem very trivial to a lot of people, and then very discordant when applied to politics, and yet there they all are, sort of, and it's, now we have, a VP with eyeliner that everyone makes fun of, but it is not a trivial detail. It's actually quite a fascinating bit of, it's the arsenal of power used in an odd way, but it's very interesting that it's sort of, yeah. Okay.
I was wondering, and thank you for the presentation, spoken mostly about work in print, and I wonder how you see podcasts fitting into this ecosystem. On the one hand, there seem to be a series of podcasts that have kind of a voracious appetite for actually sort of academic books to fill an hour. I'm thinking of BBC History Extra, or History Hits has like 3 or 4 of these. But I can imagine a couple providers that kind of stays in that silo. And I've also talked to people in publishing who say the best way not to get people to read a book is to have, a 90-minute podcast about it where they've gotten all the hits.
Sure. So when it comes to promoting the book, I did History Extra. I've done a lot of those. And I even do the smaller podcast because I'm trying to generate interest in the book. The other hat that I wear is I'm a partner at a company called History Studio, which provides historical consultation for the entertainment industry. And in an effort to promote our brand, the other partners asked me to do a podcast. And so I was the host. So I interviewed Piper Kleinman, who wrote Orange is the New Black, Dustin Lance Black, who did Milk, won the Oscar for Milk, the woman who did the book of Madam C.J., the Netflix show of Madam C.J. Walker. And I realized I'm an amazing guest, but I'm not good. I just didn't like being a host, because I would feed off of their energy, and if they felt like they were just kind of doing this, there was one with Charlie Sheen and his father. It was a baseball movie, and I had the talent come in, and they were just not really wanting to be there, and I'm doing you a favor. And so I think that podcasts can be a really generative space to bridge the gap between the academy and the mainstream. And I think that as a guest, I'm fine with it, but as a host, I struggle with it.
I think it's a really good way to get your ideas to new audiences. And you reach, I do all kinds of them. And I think it's really a great way to publicize things and speak in a, you have to know who you're speaking to, the audience, but I really like it. I also really, really like doing, so History Studio is its own operation, and I just do it as a single individual, but I get called to do consultations. It's similar work, right? On things that have a fascist theme. Now you have to, and you can come in at the very beginning of a project, like Pinocchio. I was at the very beginning, so you shape the characters, you see storyboards, or you can come in at the end, like Jojo Rabbit. I was brought in at the end just specifically to review the Hitler character to see if he was too campy. And then you have to sign NDAs. I'm working on something now, which I can't say a word about it, because I signed an NDA, and so you have to wait to be able to talk about it. But there, it can be video games, it can be documentaries, it can be, and that is extremely fun. And while you're doing it that you're going to reach a completely different audience. And that is really, it feels productive to do that work as well as being fun. So.
I just wanted to add something to this. When I used to be in your seat and I would come to events like this, I often remember the speaker saying, you have to be careful with what you do and protect your time and learn to say no. And I think that's really useful for certain people, and especially at a certain stage in their career and a certain status. But what I've learned is to say yes a lot, because you get something from it, and you also are trying to promote your ideas, and you're also learning how to do this work. So I want to give the opposite advice, which is if people are interested in you and reaching out, you can limit how much time you spend with them, but I agree to do it more times than not.
I just want to add one thing, and then I'll stop. I'm going to take just the middle ground for 1 second, which is you can say yes to many more things than you realize, because very often academics have a completely irrational idea of how much work is required. Right. Which is to say, you confuse sitting in on someone's podcast with publishing an academic article in a peer-reviewed journal, and you do not need to do. Your off-the-cuff remarks are often far better, far more interesting and complete for the purpose than you realize. So we said yes to Hofstra and Colleen.
Yeah.
Okay. So Hofstra and then Colleen.
So, looking at the book that's about to be coming out, the Resisting Autocracy, right? So coming from Turkey, it was 2016 when I came to United States, flew Turkey, and there was a podcast. I was invited in Atlanta. It was a local thing, and the question that I was asked was, do you see any warning signs in US? And it was 2016. October-ish, so you could imagine the climate. And I said yes, there are a lot of warning signs, and I invite all the people who are listening to me to be careful, cautious, watching out, and they all happened. Putting this aside, I was gonna ask if resistance means fighting against something already there. Or is there a way, I know it's an existential question, but still, is there a way, tasting the water, watching out and somehow preventing more from coming?
Yeah, that's...
We couldn't do that in Turkey.
No, so I'm glad you mentioned that. A huge motivation of doing all this work has been to allow us to... The reason I started doing this in 2015, 2016 is I was really frightened by Trump. When he said I could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone, that kind of should be disqualifying. And instead, right after that, Jeff Sessions came to a rally, put on a MAGA hat, and invited him in. And so I was really desperate to warn people that this, and so at every stage, I was trying to warn people, even by making predictions, like, guess what, people, based on what X and X did, he's not gonna leave. And I don't know what will happen, but something will happen, you know? And so studying what goes on abroad has been really helpful. But you know, people many times they think, well, Americans in particular think it can't happen here, even when it is like actually happening. And look at the different outcome of Brazil, Bolsonaro's copycat, insurrection, and because they had a coup in Brazil, a horrible long dictatorship that only ended in 1985, people there actually lived through a coup, and so they were very resolute, and he's sitting in prison now for a 27-year sentence. Instead, our guy is back in the White House. So I think that's a lot of why I do this. I'm going to have a lot of Turkish content in the resistance book, too.
I have, thank you both for your presentations, and this is a really informative panel. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how your, because you have academic appointments, how has the work that you've done in the public sphere been kind of accepted, credentialed, rewarded or not rewarded, and how could an institution that might want to valorize this kind of work structurally operationalize that?
I'm more negative on this, so
Oh my God. Okay, so I am tenured and I'm a full professor, and that is good because it's not really rewarded. Universities are making a big deal about public humanities. I personally have never been invited to do anything with public humanities at my giant NYU school. I don't. And then today, in particular, this is a long-standing thing, where if you start doing this work, you can be seen as a lightweight, that you're not doing peer-reviewed things anymore. Because I'm just not doing them. I have a whole curriculum, many books, edited books, like endless this and that. I'm just not doing that now, because I don't think I think that my efforts are better placed because of all the things I said before, and doing other things. I still am teaching. I take my classes incredibly seriously. I redo the syllabi every time. I never ever shortchange the students. But it's not really rewarded. And now, just since January 2025, where there's pressures, political pressures on universities, especially if you work in the field that I do, and you're outspoken, you could. Nobody's trying to silence me, but they're certainly not going to reward either. You can become a bother to them, like a thorn in the side. Luckily, my university is so huge that you kind of can slip through the cracks in a way. So, but I don't think that you can expect any rewards from your institution. What I will say, which has been, I did not foresee this, I have a whole other community and resources of allies and people I've met from doing this work. That if something happened, I had a stalker, I have all kinds of things. But if something happens, you know who to call, and you have a whole community of like people who are doing this work together, and it's great. It's really great, and I'm in touch with all kinds of people I never thought I'd be in touch with. I talk to members of Congress, I interview members of Congress. It's just a whole other world, and it coexists with my academic world. I still go to my faculty meetings, and my students are having their oral exams, and then I do all this other stuff. But I just don't expect anything from my institution, right? Because it's not really realistic.
But you should. Because you're contributing educationally to the broader community, and I think that's something we can have help faculty who are less protected, who don't have tenure, you know,
Yes.
to help make the climate. Sorry, Jim wanted to.
That's fine. I love listening. It hasn't been awarded at all for me. In fact, it's often been seen as a detriment. And so I'm tenured and I'm a full professor, but I'm often on the job market. And so there are ways of having to downplay it because it makes you look, as we said, as a lightweight and you're not serious. But I'm also, based on the work that I'm doing in history of medicine, history of science, I'm very much committed to also publishing academic books. So my last book was with Harvard University Press, and I'm still doing very academic things because I enjoy it and I like it, and because of this, the arguments I'm making for that work, I wanted to be credentialed from, like, the book I had about the origins of genealogy had lots of bold arguments, and I didn't want it to come out with a trade book. And I also, this goes back to the point I had before about the boomerang. I didn't want to be worried about the narrative shape of chapters. I wanted to live in the footnotes. And so for that reason, I always have enough for every promotion to not have to use it as material. So you asked the question, like, how could university administrations focus on it and think about it? I think there are ways of reviewing tenure promotion cases and thinking about doing public-facing work as important. I think that it's complicated, though, because I've been fact-checked rigorously from the New Yorker, and actually I was also wrote something for, they're just,
They call you.
They call you and they're on the phone with you, and I was fact-checked also. I didn't do something for the 1619, I was featured in the 1619 project, I can't remember, but anyway, and I was trying to explain that the word is not, you can't use virus in the 18th century, and she's like, but I know it's a virus. I'm like, I get it. But like, you end up having these like mind-numbing arguments, but they're not scholarly, and it's rigorous, but it's also not the same as when I respond to a reader's report. And so I think the struggle and the challenge is how to evaluate that work is important, because Ruth has an amazing Substack, but lots of people could do Substack, and then does that count the same as an academic article? I don't know. I mean, I don't think so. See, that's me too. I think I would put it in the category of service. I would say, even for me coming from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, it's a big deal for me to be here today. This should count as some version of a service to travel, whereas they don't think of it as anything. And so I think it's like, where do you put it? Is it in the research category? Is it in the service category? Is it possibly in the teaching category? And then how do you qualify it?
So I'm gonna, in higher ed, we're really struggling with an issue of trust and accountability with the public. And one has to wonder if universities want to try and broker and build trust with the public sphere, getting scholarship out in understandable ways, communicating what we're doing, and communicating the value of that. It is gonna be extra that's not rewarded if a university is not thinking about the impact.
They don't have rubrics, like we don't have a rubric when you do your merit review. I have nothing to put. I just did it, and I had nothing to put, even though I had huge worlds of activity. Or even like when I testified to the January 6th committee and I wrote a long report, there wasn't anywhere to put it, right? So I have my salary is kind of frozen because I don't, nothing I do fits in their rubrics.
So So I'm a linguist, and there are some mechanisms within our disciplinary organization where we have talked about ways in which what things could be counted, especially for, say, if you're working with documenting languages, and helping to unpack the labor that is involved in certain kinds of work. Does the AHA or MLA offer those kinds of models?
So the AHA has come up with an argument that this work should be recognized for scholarly promotion, but how to sort of empirically count it, it still became a huge debate at my institution.
is
So, as I'm listening to this, my question is, how do you make a decision about what to work on? Right, so like I hear you saying, it's like, okay, I know I'm gonna get credit for this or not get credit for this, but I'm weighing and considering what is the most impactful thing to do. So how do you come to that decision?
So part of why I put the books up with this, the media references as an expert is to say that is a signature moment. So when a book launches, that becomes an opportunity to really reach out to the public, both as an expert, and that's what I'm going to try to write the most. And then you also have a team of people at the press, whether it's an academic press or it's a bigger press to do it. So that's part of it. The other part of it is the example I gave with the gay massacre, which is you have to be ready if something hits that's connected to your work. And one time I remember Air Canada called me and I didn't answer and I waited 3 hours and I was off. So it's like, I think that's part of it too. They're moving so much more quickly that you also have to be agile in terms of when do they want you and are you available. So I don't know if that helps.
Everything helps.
Did you mean like, how do you know what to write, for what to focus on? Or when to write? Because Jim answered the when.
Okay. I mean, I don't want to sound away, but I do a lot of different kinds of scholarship and publishing, but people ask me to do it. So somebody comes to me and says, hey, I want you to do this, and I say, okay. So I don't have a feeling with my own work that I'm like, I'm sitting down and weighing and considering which thing to do, because I'm kind of taking the opportunities as they pop up. But it sounds like for both of you, it's like you're kind of thinking through. It's like, okay, so I have these opportunities and I have these feelings about how I can contribute where. So the question for me, like as somebody who's just very reactive to what's going on, is how are you kind of like taking through that calculus?
Mine is just driven by what I think is going to help people in the moment. But my kind of brand is that I don't do breaking news. I give a big picture. I wait, and I give in my Substack. I try and connect what's going on to patterns of either autocratic behavior or foreign relation things. For example, I've been thinking for a long time. I want to do a piece on how diplomacy crumbles, the craft of diplomacy, what happens to it, and we see now how, and I have Stefan Strongman for this, where when Berlusconi was in power, he took over privately all relations with Russia because he was a Putin partner, and the actual Ministry of Foreign Affairs was put to the side. And so now we have Kushner showing up and Witkoff, cronies. So what happens to diplomacy? And then Hegseth says we negotiate with bombs. And so that's like, I think about that every day. So I have stories I am ruminating over, and then sometimes I'll be like, should I pitch it somewhere? But I've stopped, again, I don't pitch the Atlantic because it's just zero. They never accept. So often now having a Substack, I'll just publish it in my own thing. But that's the beauty of it. Now what you miss though is you don't, I now have an editor at the New York Times who, I think she could be a co-author, get a byline with me. She's like the senior international relations. The woman is brilliant. And so she makes my pieces better, and then it makes me think, when I'm doing this myself on my Substack, maybe my pieces, I don't have an editor. I could have one. Some people hire one, but I don't do that.
But I think that's part of the genre issue. Like when we're trained as academics and we're using university press books, we're going over an idea, we're polishing it, we're editing, we're sitting with it. It has this. I think one of the things to learn about this is you have to get in there and do it and knock it out, and then just let it go and go on to something else.
Yeah,
and I think that, and just keep trying to get it out. And 50% of the time, they'll see, if they like it, it's the subject, and then they'll work with you in terms of the writing. But it's not, a lot of times we'll throw it out and just see what happens. That's what happened with the Edo rivalry stuff. Like I didn't plan to do it. I just thought, well, they're falling into lots of tropes about this. Like if the guys don't get along, they're going to go to a woman. That doesn't make any sense. That's silly. And so I wrote that, and then it connected, but then it had to be highly edited. But I think that's one of the best things I've learned about this is letting it go.
Yeah. Also, you develop, like, for me, it's a feeling that comes over me. Like, my husband will say, I have that feeling again. And what it is just like the repetitive, the culture starts speaking to you in a way that lights up the sort of electric points that you've already been working in, and you develop a kind of second sense for what will work. And you develop a wheelhouse that, it's like an instinct. It's really like a reflex. It doesn't always succeed, but that's very me, and I should try. Or it resonates with something that I did last year. So again, it's like a muscle that we keep using.
Also, we shouldn't feel bad. A lot of the people who are doing this, who are very well known, especially the men, they have endowed chairs, which there's a huge gender problem in endowed chairs, or gender opportunity. And so they're just not teaching very much. And so you can always, it's the comparing problem, why didn't I get it, why haven't I done as much? But, you have a different circumstance. So there's also that. It's not an equal playing field to start. So some people have more time to be on it because they're just not teaching very much, right? There are all kinds of, some endowed chairs you're teaching a lot, but some you're not. So there's also that. So we shouldn't feel badly.
Despair is not helpful. Yeah, that kind of frustration and despair in this whole realm of public media is useless to you for all of the reasons that we don't.
Yeah.
You have to let everything go and start anew. But we have reached time.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening.
Perfect, thank you. Yes, perfect, thank you so much. Yeah, I really wanted to ask.
That's surprising.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking.
I was hopeful they might, but yeah, it's not.
Well, I did write, I heard a lot about this stuff. I had a lot of